Past 2 weeks, I have driven myself to the brink of insanity watching every Frankenstein movie in existence. I watched more Frankenstein movies than I thought was possible in these 2 weeks, and Frankenstein invaded every aspect of my life, every conversation, every thought. I even started having dreams about Frankenstein's monster. And why? I don't know, I thought it could be fun. My history with Frankenstein started when I was just a toddler. Can't remember even what piece of media introduced me to the big green oaf that we all know and love, but I began having a recurring nightmare where Frankenstein would chase me from place to place in my childhood, like hometown. And then when I got to the public library, it was always the Oswego Public Library. Frankenstein's monster would rip the roof off of the building and then get me and strangle me, which I realize is a very dark dream for a 4-year old to be having, but I don't know what was behind that. That said, in middle school, when those dreams were far behind me, my parents introduced me to one of their favorite comedies of all time, which is Young Frankenstein. And I enjoyed the movie. It scared me a little bit just because of that nightmare I used to have. But since then, I had forgotten about Frankenstein for a couple of years. And a few years after that young Frankenstein viewing experience, I was in high school and I was looking through some of my sister's old books. I think I was looking for The Great Gatsby at the time for one of my classes. And I saw a copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and it interested me. I picked it up and I flipped through the pages and I saw that this was a school assignment for my sister. And so the pages were full of annotations. Those annotations were some of the funniest things I've ever read, and I wish I could recall some. I tried looking for that book before shooting this video, but unfortunately I couldn't find it. I think we threw it away. It was just one of those throwaway paper books that you get for a high school class and then never really think about again. So I think it is somewhere long gone at a dump or something. But that scared me away from this book for a long time because I really respect my sister's opinions on that stuff. I feel like I generally tend to agree with her on most media, and I didn't really have any interest in exploring a book that she hated so much. That is, until earlier this month, I finally read, or I guess I listened to the audiobook of Frankenstein. And a lot of books I feel like are meant to be read. This one felt like it should work better as an audiobook simply because of the frame story. We have a narrator throughout most of this, and I really enjoyed the performance. I can't remember who was the narrator for this audiobook, but I really loved it. And since then, I have picked up one of these cloth-bound classics from Barnes and Noble. I love this cover of the anatomically correct heart. I think it's beautiful, and I am very excited to fully read and probably make my own annotations of this novel that my sister hated so much. After reading that book, I embarked on a nearly 50-hour journey of watching every Frankenstein movie imaginable. And for those of you who don't know, there are so many more Frankenstein movies than I thought was possible. I have watched, I believe, 35 films for this video. And like I said, that's around 50 hours. But this journey spans 100 years of cinema history. And I'm really excited to take you all down that journey with me. However, before we dive in, I got to break down how I'm even going to try to explain my thoughts on each of these movies. And I think the best way to do that is by going chronologically through each release and placing them into a tier list. That tier list is going to be made up of the peak of horror media at the top. Mary Shelley would be proud. The 2019 Indianapolis Colts, which, if we have any sports fans out there watching, the 2019 Colts, led by Jacoby Brissett, are maybe the most mid team I've ever seen in my life. Then, running out of ideas, huh? This is just derivative stuff, not very great, pretty boring. Maybe movies were a mistake. These are ones that really made me regret even committing to this project. And lastly, we are going to be talking about some lost films today, which is a phenomenon that kind of baffles me. I will also be giving my blast grade for each movie, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with the podcast on this channel or any of the other videos we do on other social media, a blast grade is how much you enjoyed the movie, whether it taught you something, whether it impacted you emotionally, stuff like that, not just the objective movie score. First, I have to talk about the novel because when I started reading this, my expectations were fairly low, as I'm sure you would imagine after that history I described, but I was blown away by how phenomenal this book is. It is the most well-written book I've ever read. I can't believe this wasn't part of my high school curriculum because this feels like something every English teacher would eat up, and honestly, I just loved it so much. Every sentence is a pure work of art from Mary Shelley. I did clip out my favorite quote from this book, and that is, "Even broken in spirit as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seems still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double existence. He may suffer misery and be overwhelmed by disappointments, yet when he has retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures." That is just like the epitome of art through language. I love Mary Shelley's writing style. I seriously was just blown away by this book, and it quickly leapt to the top. This is now my favorite book of all time. Previously, that was kind of a toss up between Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men, which is also one of my favorite movies of all time, and The Stranger by Albert Camus, because I do enjoy a good piece of philosophical fiction. I just love what this has to say about blind ambition, what it takes to find true happiness, what that means for different people, creator versus creation. I think there is so much to be said about this book, and I feel like every time I'm going to reread it, I will find something new, which is the number one thing I look for in a book. And obviously, this is going into the peak of horror media tier and a blast grade of A+. I cannot believe how beautiful this story is. All right, let's start talking about some of these classic films, starting with, of course, Frankenstein 1910. It is pretty hard to tell what's going on in this movie, which I guess is fair. I mean, I watched it for free on YouTube, but it's over 100 years old. I mean, I am not expecting a ton of production quality here. I thought the monster design was super funny, and as far as I could tell, they got most of the theme right. They got most of the story elements right. I kind of enjoyed this. It was only 16 minutes long, so it's not a super long commitment either, which helps. And all in all, I think I'm going to give it a blast grade of a B. But tier wise, it's hard for me to put a silent movie any higher than that mid tier, so I am going to put this in the 2019 Indianapolis Colts. The next two films on the list are actually lost films, so they will be going into that tier. But those two movies are kind of worth discussing. That is Il Mostro de Frankenstein and Life Without a Soul. And it's kind of baffling to me that films from, I guess, 100 years ago have been lost. Like, nobody has seen this that is still alive. And all we have is a couple of stills from one. And I believe Il Mostro de Frankenstein only has one single still. And when I saw it, it's hard to distinguish what's happening. It looks like the monster's choking somebody, but I would have loved to actually see that movie. Unfortunately, I am not a miracle worker, so the blast grade is an NA, and it is going in the Lost Films tier. After the two Lost films, we are brought to probably the most well known Frankenstein of all time, which is Frankenstein 1931. This is the ultimate classic. It established the look of the Frankenstein monster that we know today, which, interestingly enough, in the book, Frankenstein is yellow, but to make him appear more ghostly or sick or whatever back in the 30s, they had to apply full green makeup so that it would look a little off in the black and white camera, which is why Frankenstein in popular media is green nowadays. This is just so horribly Americanized that it's hard for me to get behind it at all. I mean, we're really going so far to rename Victor to Henry, but Frankenstein isn't like the selling point that he's German. This is so strange to me as a choice. And I think that there's an interesting line when you're adapting something, because I don't think there's really anything honorable in adapting a book to a movie if you don't change anything. And I also don't think it's super great if you change everything. I think that Charlie Kaufman's adaptation is a masterful study of this kind of phenomenon, but in general, I like a movie that maybe takes some risks in how they present the themes, but uses the same themes as the book they are adapting from. And this movie does not do that at all, in my opinion. I really disliked it. I thought it was very boring, and I just could not get behind the changes that were made from book to movie for this specific adaptation. I mean, the story itself here like hardly bears a resemblance to the original, which is just the number one like let's stop and reassess here point for me. I just really despised the risks that were taken by the filmmaker here, and I am giving it a blast grade of a D. And the tier, I'm hovering between the bottom two. I'm gonna put it in maybe movies were a mistake, which I realize will probably irk some of the big classic cinema fans, but I really, really dislike this one. However, Bride of Frankenstein was much, much better in my opinion, and I think that's because it's a little further removed from the source material. Of course, Frankenstein, the novel, has this Bride of Frankenstein storyline kind of coming in, but the way that this was so far removed from that because of the differences in the original film to the novel, I think that that made this a little more forgivable for me. I will say, what's with the tiny guys? They're like little tiny people in glass jars that one of the scientists come over with, and I just cannot understand for the life of me what that was supposed to signify, if it was supposed to signify anything or just be a stupid joke. But very, very strange from a directorial or writing standpoint there. The best part of Bride of Frankenstein is the ending. You have the iconic line drop from Frankenstein's monster, "We're meant to be dead." And that makes this movie for me. I think that the best thing a movie can do is have a strong ending or strong beginning, or preferably both, so that you can kind of forgive some of the mistakes made in the middle. And I think Bride of Frankenstein does that pretty well. I'm going to give this a blast grade of a B minus, and for the tier, I'm going to go. I think I'm going to go in Mary Shelley Would Be Proud, because I feel like the themes in this story specifically are a little closer to those of the book. Let's talk Son of Frankenstein now, because this is one of my favorites of all of the Frankenstein movies I watched, which I was not expecting. I had no expectations for Son of Frankenstein, quite frankly. I did not know that that's what Young Frankenstein was a parody of until like 5 minutes into this movie. So once I realized that, I was immediately more interested, and I guess that is very biased, but I loved seeing how the jokes could like evolve into what they were in Young Frankenstein. I thought that was one of the coolest parts of this movie. However, the coolest part of this movie was the main character. We have the son of Victor Frankenstein, or Henry Frankenstein, in this, and he is out on a quest to prove that his father was not the monster that everybody believes he was. His father was just misunderstood. His father was screwed over by an inept assistant, and that you are more than your family name, as well as some more interesting ideas about fear and love. I just really adored this movie. I can't give it enough praise. This is a perfect example of taking excellent source material and adding to it years down the line so that you can make something your own, while also adding to that original artist's work. The blast grade for this is an easy A for me, and the tier, I'm close to putting in the peak of horror media, but I think I'm going to keep it in Mary Shelley Would Be Proud. It's just a little bit lower than some of the movies that are in that top tier. So there is kind of like a series of the first five Frankenstein movies that were like major Hollywood productions, and that is Frankenstein 31, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, and then Ghost of Frankenstein. And the next movie we'll be talking about, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. But Ghost of Frankenstein is the only one of those that is not streaming anywhere. I had to rent this. And I have a little rant about the minutes per dollar ratio here because on Fandango at Home or Vudu, I bought Zack Snyder's Watchmen a few weeks ago, and that averaged out. It was $4, so it averaged out to about 60 minutes per dollar. This movie was only 67 minutes. I was spending $1 for every 16.75 minutes of film, and it was shit. That is just unfair, in my opinion. I think that prices should scale with length of movie. Um, but as far as the actual movie goes, I can't really wrap my head around how many doctors there are in the Frankenstein family. We're following like son, brother, daughter. It's just feels like every single person in the Frankenstein family is obsessed with the same thing that Victor was, or once again, I guess that would be Henry here. Um, it doesn't really make sense to me in this movie specifically how the monster has become like completely superhuman. I feel like we see a little bit of that in Mary Shelley's book with him having like faster reflexes and stuff like that. But at the end of Son of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster is pushed into a sulfur pit, which I would assume would just like disintegrate the body. I'm not an expert on sulfur and didn't really know that you could have a sulfur pit, but it felt like that was a conclusion to the monster. And now he's kind of just fine. And Frankenstein has the opportunity here to kill the monster multiple times, which I would assume the best way to do that is just removing the brain. And he actually does surgery on the monster and puts in Igor's brain. I just don't understand a lot of the logic in this movie. For that reason, Blast Grade C, tier 2019 Indianapolis Colts. Next up, we have Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and there is a shocking lack of Frankenstein in this movie. It is a Wolfman movie first, but it is pretty interesting in that way. I like the way that Victor is actually like respected in this movie by a couple of the main characters. Of course, the townspeople hate him, and for good reason, but it's interesting to see another perspective of, oh, well, this is the only doctor who could possibly help you because he's both the only one that would believe you and the only one that would know what to do. I think that that's an interesting way to portray Victor Frankenstein. However, how did the monster get frozen in ice? Like this movie starts with Frankenstein's monster being frozen in ice and then defrosted by the Wolfman in hopes that that can like somehow help him. I'm just puzzled as to how that situation came to be, and I was expecting some sort of explanation and we never get it. And my other big gripe with the movie is that the ending showdown is super underwhelming. It lasts for like 30 seconds and then we cut to credits. Come on, guys. We don't get to see even who wins the fight between Frankenstein and the Wolfman. It just like the whole castle kind of collapses down and gets them both. So very underwhelmed. The blast grade here is still going to be a C just because I did really enjoy some of the Wolfman plot elements. But the tier, once again, is going in the Indianapolis Colts. And we are moving on to our last classic. Let's talk about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I loved this movie, and I was not expecting to, because usually any black and white comedies are pretty much just wastes of time for me. I hate all the screwball stuff from the early era of Hollywood, and I kind of associate Abbott and Costello with that era. I don't know if maybe my timing's off or something, but these guys are actually pretty funny, which is cool. Obviously, I've seen the Who's on First routine, and that is the only Abbott and Costello like context I had going into this movie. So expectations were low, and it did really surprise me. However, the thing that's going to keep this lower on the tier list is that Frankenstein's monster wasn't actually in it that much. This was much more of a Dracula movie with Frankenstein as a kind of side character. So I was hoping for more of the monster. Ended up with mostly just Dracula. Very disappointing. And the blast grade is going to be a B for a lot of the good gags in this. The tier, however, I'm between the Colts and Mary Shelley would be proud, but I feel like Mary Shelley would have had a good laugh at this. I'm gonna go with that one, and that's a great way to wrap up this classics segment. The age of the classic is done, and the Peter Cushing era has begun. For those of you who don't know Peter Cushing by name, he is Mr. Cheekbones in Star Wars. He is Grand Moff Tarkin, and he starred in 6 Frankenstein movies. I was not able to watch all of them, but I will explain that when I get there. And let's jump right into The Curse of Frankenstein. My big complaint here is that it feels like none of these movies really get Victor's motivations right. But this movie does get a majority of the themes right. Victor is just completely wrong, in my opinion, and that holds true for all 6 of these movies. He never really realizes his mistake, which is something that happens fairly quickly in the book. This movie is high for me simply because it's such a cool cast. We have Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein, and the monster is played by Christopher Lee. That is so cool to me and really brings it up. What brings it down slightly is the character of Paul in this movie is just the worst friend anybody could ever ask for. This guy sucks so much. I cannot believe that Victor was ever friends with him. And the way that Paul treats Victor when he starts to go insane is just awful. I was hoping for a character that would support Victor more and try to set him on the right path, but instead Paul just abandons him, and it feels like that leads to a lot of Victor's strange choices throughout these 6 or 7 movies, and I was not a fan of that. The blast grade for this is going to be B, and I'm putting it in the Indianapolis Colts tier. Next up, we have the Revenge of Frankenstein. And this movie starts with one of the strangest scenes I have ever watched in my life. And a couple of people are digging up Victor Frankenstein's grave. I can't remember why. They had some, like, oh, he was buried with gold reason or something like that. But Victor is standing there watching them. And I believe he kills them afterwards. I'm just very puzzled as to why Victor was just standing at his grave in the middle of the night there. He should have had no idea that that was happening, and it was a rough start to this movie that was otherwise pretty good. Peter Cushing is a very talented actor, and that is really shown throughout this series of movies. However, he is not a heartthrob, and this movie wants you to believe that wholeheartedly, which is so funny to me. Basically, every rich woman in town is lined up for Victor's clinic, not having any issues. They just want to see the doctor. And there's some weird scenes where, like, the one that jumps out is this girl is standing there and she's like, "Oh, won't you listen to my heart without that cold stethoscope? I just want your ear around my chest." Like, okay, really? It's Peter Cushing. Come on, guys. My favorite part of this movie, though, is that his experiment was actually successful. That is such like a cool moment that comes to fruition here. That the experiment works, and a man who was horribly like paralyzed, or I think he had a hunchback or something. Sorry, I watched 35 of these movies, so I can't remember every detail. Is transported into a new body that he can actually live in, but of course, the patient goes awry, and Victor is caught that he is not who he said he was. I believe he's going by Dr. Stein in this movie. And it all goes downhill from there. I would love to see one Frankenstein movie where just everything goes right. I think that would be an interesting concept to explore. But unfortunately, in all of these movies, that does not happen. For Revenge of Frankenstein, I'm giving a blast grade of a B plus because this did keep me engaged the entire time. And for the tier, I'm going with Mary Shelley Would Be Proud. Next for this series, we have the Evil of Frankenstein, and this made me ask, how many times is this monster going to be revived? In The Curse of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster is brought back to life or reanimated, and then killed, and then reanimated once again. And the Evil of Frankenstein sees him reanimated even again. And this is just a blatant ripoff of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I'm not sure why that needed to happen for this movie, but its biggest sin is not that it's just a cheap copy, it's that they expect us to believe that street hypnotists are the real deal, and a street hypnotist could hypnotize Frankenstein's monster and have him go around stealing gold from everybody in the city. That is one of the stupidest things I could think of. Blast grade, D plus, tier, running out of ideas, huh? Now, you might remember at the beginning of this specific segment, I said that I couldn't see a few of these films, and this brings me to a little bit of a discussion of the modern era of lost films, which is essentially just movies that aren't picked up on any streaming services, like not even anything you can rent on. And the next three movies in this franchise were that type of lost films. That is Frankenstein Created Woman, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and The Horror of Frankenstein. All of these movies were unrentable. I could have gotten DVDs off of Amazon, but I wasn't super interested in what they had to say. I read the plot synopses just to keep up with what was happening with our boy Victor, and he goes down a pretty dark path here. Looks like some SA stuff, which is obviously nothing I really want to see in a Frankenstein movie. And the Horror of Frankenstein apparently is just a remake of the Curse of Frankenstein without Peter Cushing. So we waited, I think, 10 years for that to happen, which is blasphemous, in my opinion. The blast grade here is just going to be another NA since I couldn't see them, but the tier is going to be lost films, of course. Lastly, rounding out the Peter Cushing septilogy, I guess this would be, is Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Finally, a conclusion to the series. I'm praying that Victor gets what he deserves in this and just dies. He was actually sent to the guillotine after the Curse of Frankenstein. That's how it ends, and we are led to believe that he dies there. And of course, he does not, and goes on for 6 more movies. The best part of this one is that Peter Cushing finally looks like Grand Moff Tarkin. He's like getting up there. I think this movie was from 74 off the top of my head. And Star Wars, of course, was 1977. Very, very cool to see him kind of age into this like evil mastermind look. And I really enjoyed his performance in this movie. His skills also get better with each movie, despite some of the dialogue getting a little bit worse. The most interesting choice here is that the movie is set in a mental institution, which is a very cool place to set a Frankenstein movie, I guess. We have some weird things happening with Frankenstein, like reanimating a half monkey, half man, which I wasn't necessarily a fan of. And they also kind of, I realize they can't copy a movie from the future, but this reminded me of Mutt from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the way Victor kind of takes on this strange little protege who's very interested in his work and is maybe going to be the future of this series if they get a sequel, which of course they did not. But the biggest strength of this, I think, is the ending. We get a full-on Clockwork Orange ending with Victor just jumping right back into his experiments after a number of people die. And we see this man is never, ever, ever going to change. He will never learn his lesson. It's a very bleak outlook and one that I really enjoyed. The blast grade, there were some things I liked, some things I didn't. I'm going with a C, just straight down the middle. And the tier, of course, is the 2019 Indianapolis Colts. Our next era is the 70s and 80s, which is one of my favorite periods of film in Hollywood history. I was really excited to jump into this, and we're kicking it off with Blackenstein. Blackenstein is a direct result of the hit Blackula, but this one has none of the charm and sucks so bad. This is a movie that is bad in a boring way, which is hard to do for a horror movie, in my opinion. And it just has the worst writing I've ever seen, coupled with the worst acting I've ever seen. It's like if you take the writing from the live action Dragon Ball movie and couple it with the acting from The Room. Like if you have Tommy Wiseau as the lead of Dragon Ball Evolution, you get Blackenstein. It is awful. Awful, awful, awful. Everything sucks here. I couldn't get through it. I watched 45 minutes and turned it off. And we are going to move right on. Blast grade F, tier, maybe movies were a mistake. Let's follow Blackenstein, though, with I think my favorite Frankenstein movie on this list, which is The Spirit of the Beehive. Now, this movie starts really strong with people being brought together during a incredibly tough time through movies. This takes place after the Spanish Civil War, and the community comes together for a traveling cinemas showing of Frankenstein. And our main character is a child here who is very confused both why Frankenstein killed the little girl and why the town then killed Frankenstein's monster. It is very, very interesting, very beautiful. Every shot in this looks like a painting, and that really elevated it for me. This is also just some of the best writing I've ever seen in a Frankenstein movie, probably the best. This feels like a movie I would have seen when I was working for the Chicago International Children's Film Festival at Facets, and I think it would have won one of our top prizes there because it's truly just stunning start to finish. It begs a lot of interesting questions about whether we are only our disagreements, and I love that theme. I think it's beautiful. Blast grade A plus. This almost made me cry when I watched it at work. And tier peak of horror media for sure. It's right up there with the novel, just not quite as good, but maybe after a couple of rewatches, it could get there. It's that stunning of a movie, and I encourage you all to check it out. It is something that truly you only see once in a lifetime. After Spirit of the Beehive, we have the most 1980s movie on this list, which is The Phantom of the Paradise, Brian De Palma's rock opera, which had a lot less Frankenstein than I was imagining. Frankenstein only appears for like 5 minutes in this, and it's not even him. Male glam rock star Beef dresses up as Frankenstein, but sparkly, and gives a performance. And that is all we see of Frankenstein's monster in this movie. I don't know why it was on all the lists that I was looking at, but nevertheless, I watched it. I really enjoyed a lot of De Palma's choices, but since it isn't really a Frankenstein movie, I'm just going to level it out between my love for Brian De Palma in that top tier and no Frankenstein in it for the bottom tier. We're going to meet in the middle at 2019 Indianapolis Colts with a blast grade of B+. Now we get to one of my favorite Frankenstein movies out there, Young Frankenstein. This might be the best one. There are great bits all the way through, and I just think movies might be better when Frankenstein's monster canonically has a hog. I mean, it's crazy how many Frankenstein monsters dick jokes there are in this movie, especially for it being from 79. It feels a little ahead of its time there. Gene Wilder is a comedic genius. I love that guy. Love him in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and everything else I've seen him in. He was a co-writer on this film, and you can feel that all the way through. This is just truly a breathtaking achievement of comedic cinema, and it deserves its blast grade of an A+, with the tier being the peak of horror media. Now, moving on to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, I understand this is a movie that a lot of people love, 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 and I can understand why. I really can, but this is just not for me. It's not my type of humor. I hate movie musicals. That's really the main thing that pulls it back for me. I think movie musicals are the worst type of movie out there. Just the way that all logic and reality are thrown out the window every time there's a song sucks. La La Land is the only exception for me of a movie musical that I enjoy, and I think the soundtrack film will hopefully kick musicals out the door for the Hollywood scene in the future. That said, I couldn't even get through this. He does something to both parties of a couple that I found to be quite distasteful and not something that I enjoyed. Impersonating other people is bad in that context, and It made me really uncomfortable. I turned it off. Blast grade F. Tier, maybe movies were a mistake. I hope you guys can forgive me. I know so many people love, love, love this movie. I just really could not get behind it. Next up, Frankenweenie, 1984. I hate Tim Burton. That is something I am proud to say. I think that Tim Burton makes fake horror movies for people who want to say that they're edgy and like horror movies without actually watching any horror movies. And Frankenweenie 84 has so much charm. I was surprised. This is a Tim Burton movie that I like. Put it up there with Big Fish as the only ones. Um, there was a beautiful aspect to this. It felt like a home movie, and there was so much nostalgia. I loved the use of mini golf as a setting in this to play off Frankenstein 1931. There were a few genuinely really great gags, including the dog drinking water and it like popping out of his neck seams. I always love seeing Shelley Duvall in movies. I think she is a delight on the screen, and I just really, really hope they don't make this into an animated feature film, because it works so well as a live action short. My blast grade is A minus, and the tier, it's almost at peak of horror media, but I'm keeping it at Mary Shelley would be proud. And of course, we will be ending the 80s with another rough one, Frankenhooker. This is a movie that I remember scrolling past on Netflix like every time I opened up the app when I was in like 6th grade. This is so bad that it's just not quite good. It's almost to a level of comedy where it's good, but it takes itself just a little too seriously, I think. Or maybe it's just trying a little too hard to be bad. It just doesn't quite strike the balance. I can't put my finger on why. There were a couple of good bits, and the concept itself is so absurd that it is funny. But I've never been an exploitation film guy. I've never really understood the love of those movies. And so I am going to give it a blast grade of D. And the tier is not quite movies were a mistake, but we're running out of ideas, huh? All right. That concludes our 70s to 80s portion of the video. We are going to jump in now to, though we're still trying this section, which begins with Edward Scissorhands. And let me tell you a little story about my 8th grade English class where our teacher was a huge Tim Burton fan, which of course was an issue for me because we had a film unit. This was my first piece of film education, and it scared me off from the subject for quite a while because for our film unit, we spent, I think, a full month only watching Tim Burton films. And that is the Johnny Depp Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which I'm not a big fan of, Edward Scissorhands, which I, spoiler alert, hate, Big Fish, which I really enjoyed. Those 3 films. And Edward Scissorhands, I believe we watched 4 times in a single week, and one of those times was without volume. I cannot describe the mental anguish that week caused me. I hate this movie so much. I was so glad when we moved on to Big Fish, and that is still one of my favorite movies ever to this day. But this Edward Scissorhands, sorry if you like it, my blast grade is an F from that movie class, and the tier, maybe movies were a mistake. The next movie actually had me wondering if Kenneth Branagh is good at his job. I feel like this guy gets so much directing work, so much acting work, and every time I'm just disappointed by it. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a movie I was really looking forward to because I had heard that it was the most accurate adaptation of the book. However, it sucked. And I don't know, like most of the plot beats were there, and the changes that they did make just made no sense to me. Something the entire time just felt off. I don't know if that was the strange camera work from Branagh or just that Bobby De Niro was Frankenstein's monster. That might be the stupidest casting choice I've ever heard in my entire life. But the biggest sin this has is just that it is boring. You took a book that was riveting to read and made it something that I was fighting my eyelids for the entire time. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein does get a blast grade of D from me in the tier. We're running out of ideas, huh? Next is a movie that is maybe single-handedly responsible for the Emoji Movie. That is Igor. This is the same director as the Emoji Movie, I believe 6 years prior to it, and I hated it. The voice cast is awful here. John Cusack is horrible as our lead Igor, and the animation style does have some charm that gives it like a single point, but this movie is just absolute nothingness. This is slop. If I saw this for the Children's Film Festival, I would have given it an F, and watching it recreationally, I'm giving it a D minus. So maybe movies were a mistake. This movie sucked so much. So remember when I said that Tim Burton made a really great movie that I hope didn't get remade into an animated feature-length film? Well, it did. Frankenweenie 2012 lost all the charm of the original. I don't understand anything in this movie. Any choices made, it feels like a total sellout by Burton, which is something that he does not usually do. That is my singular compliment I will give that guy besides Big Fish. And I just don't understand the concept of the science fair bringing dinosaurs back to life. The whole thing felt so stupid to me. It took away some of my love for that original short, and I'm giving this a D minus blast grade. I just really despise the existence of this movie and the tier. Maybe movies were a mistake. Or maybe they weren't, because Scooby Doo FrankenCreepy is rounding out this section of Frankenstein movies. This is top notch Scooby Doo. It is my second favorite ever, behind Scooby Doo Stage Fright. Those of you who have listened to any episode of the pod probably know that I am like the number one Scooby Doo fan on the planet. I've watched, I think, every single Scooby Doo movie at this point, and FrankenCreepy is one of the best because its editing style is awesome. It takes some risks here that are not usually taken in Scooby Doo movies. Usually you get cut and paste of the same thing, which I'm not complaining about, but the mystery machine explodes in this, and throughout the movie, we kind of have smash cuts back to that mystery machine exploding as like Fred's kind of Vietnam. And I love that gag so much. It made me laugh multiple times when I watched this. I also love the gags of Velma von Dinkenstein. I think that is so funny and works so well. Fat Daphne, also hilarious. And satiated Scooby and Shaggy. Scooby and Shaggy can't eat in this movie. What are they going to do? That is such a clever way to kind of reverse the roles on everybody in this movie. I think it works really, really well. Blast grade A plus tier. Peak of horror media, up there with the greats. All right, don't worry, guys. We're almost done because we are on our last section here, the modern era. Starting with Van Helsing. This is a super weird look for Frankenstein's monster, but it's cool that he is kind of one of the protagonists for once. He is smart and trying to stop Dracula's evil plan here, which is very cool. And I love the concept for that crossover, but the CGI was horrible. I think that if I had nostalgia for this movie, I would really enjoy it, but I watched it for the first time during this project. If I had a background for this, like Brendan Fraser's The Mummy, I probably would love it. It would probably be up there in the peak of horror media, but instead, I have to give it a blast grade of a D, and the tier, we're running out of ideas, huh? However, it gets worse. I Frankenstein is just slop. Aaron Eckhart, what happened, man? You just did Dark Knight, and you come in to do a movie where you play Frankenstein's monster who plays a pivotal role in the war between gargoyles and demons. This is maybe the stupidest movie I've ever seen in my life. The blast grade is an F. The tier, maybe movies were a mistake. I won't waste any more of your time on this when I had to waste 97 minutes watching it. Speaking of stupidity, we have Victor Frankenstein, starring James McAvoy and Daniel Radcliffe. A great start. I was intrigued. The editing is so strange. This is one of the stupidest title cards I've ever seen in my life. It like comes out in parchment paper and writes out Victor Frankenstein's signature with James McAvoy like posed up like this. It looks so stupid. I cannot believe it. And the rest of this movie matches that stupidity. It is generally just nonsense. Victor is a complete jerk the entire movie. Doesn't make any character decisions that make any sense, and they change his backstory a little bit, which also didn't really leave me feeling good about this movie. I thought the whole thing was stupid, and I am glad I will never have to watch it again. Blast grade F tier, maybe movies were a mistake. And what a horrible stretch, because the next movie here is The Monsters 2022. I hate Rob Zombie. I hate everything about him. I hate his movies, and The Monsters is no exception. I think that the concept for this is stupid. Shout out to my favorite DJ of all time, Nosferatu, though. I hope that didn't ruin Robert Eggers' upcoming movie adaptation of Nosferatu. I am really excited for that, but I'm a little worried I'm never going to be able to unsee Nosferatu showing funny, cute pictures of his pet rats to Dracula's daughter. I hated every second of this. Pretty unwatchable. Blast grade D minus, just because Nosferatu gives it 1 point. That was a little funny. The tier, maybe movies were a mistake once again. Luckily, that is the last of those movies. Our second to last movie in this Frankenstein project is Poor Things, a movie that was really well received by audiences and critics alike. And I am a big Yorgos Lanthimos fan. I love The Lobster. I love Killing of a Sacred Deer. I think he's a very talented filmmaker. This one is interesting, but kind of messed up as a concept. Having everybody want to have sex with a girl who has the mind of an infant is one that did not sit right with me. I had a lot of trouble accepting that that's where this movie was going. But a lot of the humor does work. I did feel like, in terms of feminism, which I am not an expert on, this felt like a little behind the times. Again, don't quote me, but I believe this is mostly centered around like third wave feminism, where it's all about like sexual freedom. And I feel like we've moved a little further away from that. And besides the feminism in this, the other ideas are just very surface level. Like there's a big thing where like, oh my God, poor people exist. Like I get that this Emma Stone's creature, I guess, was born very recently, but I think that that whole scene and segment were pretty stupid, and it doesn't bother diving any deeper than scratching the surface. That said, Emma Stone is just amazing. I love her as an actress, and I really, really, really did enjoy her performance in this. Willem Dafoe is awesome too, and Mark Ruffalo gives one of the best comedic performances I've ever seen. The blast grade on this is going to be a B minus, and it's going in the 2019 Indianapolis Colts tier. And finally, I hope I haven't lost you guys, we have Lisa Frankenstein. The biggest sin of this movie is that it's just so boring. I don't like Cole Sprouse as the monster. The humor is mostly stupid and cruel, but definitely a big step up from Rocky Horror for me. I did enjoy a lot of themes in this movie, and I love the main actress. I am blanking on her name, but she is from Freaky, is the first thing I saw her in, where she body swaps with Vince Vaughn. I thought that was an awesome movie. And Catherine Newton, she is amazing. I think she is like next up on the Hollywood A-list, and I did enjoy her enough to give this a blast grade of C and put it in the 2019 Indianapolis Colts tier. That concludes the project that has taken me so long to create. If I was Victor Frankenstein, this video would be my monster. Funny enough, I was feeling a lot of fatigue while watching all these movies, but when it was over, I did catch myself scrolling through streaming. I think I was on Shudder, and a few movies came up that I was like, oh, interesting. Not enough Frankenstein, though. So I'm a little worried that this project has done to me what Elvis did to Austin Butler, where he is now just permanently Elvis. I feel like my mind is constantly Victor Frankenstein now. So a little worried about that. Let me know what movies you think I have a horribly wrong take on, which ones I got right, and if I missed any, because there are a lot of Frankenstein movies out there. I could not watch all like 150 some, but I got a good selection here that I hope you guys are happy with. Also, please go check out the Blast Movie app. You can either search Blast Movie app on the App Store or go to www.blastmovies.net. This is an app I built with my best friend, and it is all about sharing movie theater experiences or just movie watching experiences in general, and helping create bonds over movies, because movies can be more than just movies. There will be a link to that website in the description below, as well as a link to our TikTok and Instagram if you have any interest in checking out some podcast clips from us. We have a lot of good content on there. And I will catch you next time. Hopefully, not driving myself mad watching a billion Frankenstein movies.